Good. Well, that title was the original title of my paper. It has mutated a little bit ever since. And I've now called it A New World is Being Born Beyond the Graveyard, the Prison, and Exile. I start my paper. If the connection is too bad, you will tell me so that maybe I just leave my voice on and switch off my video, if that will help. But I start my paper with a quotation from Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage in the 3rd century, when he said this about pestilence. And he said, pestilence and plagues search out the righteousness of each and every one and examines the minds of the human race. End of quote. We now know that more than 43 million people have been infected and that over 1 million have died globally. By the end of this year, South Africa will have been under COVID-19 lockdown for more than 60% of the year 2020. Over 700,000 South Africans have been infected and more than 600,000 have recovered. The official death toll in South Africa stands at about 18,000. But there is a great deal of debate among the experts as to whether that number is really the correct one, whether everyone who died because of COVID-19 has been recorded as such in this country. And in fact, all over the continent of Africa, there is that debate. Now, I paint 3 pictures, and if you can allow me just to talk to the 3 metaphors. One I take from the Bible. The second one I take from the world of fiction. And the third one also from the world of fiction, before I try and propose not so much a solution, but complicate the picture even more before I stop. In March 2009, I did a Bible study on Mark 5, which was published in the International Review of Mission. You will recall that Mark 5 begins with the story of a man possessed with an impure spirit, depending on which version of the Bible you read. As Jesus arrived in the Gerasene region by boat, the troubled man emerges out of the graveyard and pounces. I have renamed the troubled man the graveyard man. He went running towards Jesus and knelt before him. And before the man could utter a word, Jesus had already issued a command for the impure spirit to come out of the man. But the unclean spirit inside the graveyard man responded and proceeded to conduct a curious conversation with Jesus. And so at the top of his voice, the graveyard man pleaded, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of Most High God? In God's name, please don't torture me." Now, the evangelist Mark unfolds the story quite deftly, I think. To prepare his reader for the looming drama, Mark first provides in very few words an excellent abridged CV and a vivid character mapping of the graveyard man. And I quote from Mark, "This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones." Now, at my most depressed moments of COVID-19 lockdown in South Africa, I went looking in my mind for the graveyard man of Mark 5. as I undertook the many journeys from my study to the kitchen, from the front door to the garden and back, from the bedroom to the bathroom, I sometimes took the opportunity to look into the mirror, and lo and behold, the graveyard man would stare back at me, and there was a smirk in his face. At those moments, I would feel mad. Mad in the American sense of the word, as in mad at the graveyard man for invading my home and my tormented consciousness. But I also felt mad, as in feeling like there was a loose screw in my brain, so that sometimes I felt tempted to start an argument with the jacaranda tree that sits smugly in the middle of the small garden in front of my house. At those times, I felt as if my entire country was the graveyard in which the Makan graveyard man resided. No, actually, I imagined a massive and unstoppable graveyard extending across the land, taking over the country acre by acre, 1 square kilometer at a time, like a shadow of a moving cloud. In this daytime nightmare of mine, of imagining the world and my country as a graveyard, our four major cities, Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, and Durban, were the epicenters from which the graveyard was daily expanding seismically across the land. Now, perhaps part of the reason I had this nightmare is because the MEC for Health in Gauteng threatened in July that he was going to build 1.5 million grave sites for what he called potential mass burials. Now, it took me some time to work out why I had this haunting sense of the Makan graveyard man until I returned to the Bible study, which I did 10 years ago. Not being a biblical scholar, I probably was violating many hermeneutical protocols because I read Mark 5 as if it was one story. Now, you will recall that Mark 5 consists, in fact, of 3 stories. The graveyard man, the woman with a flow of blood, and the story of Jairus, the man who went looking for Jesus because his little girl was dying. And in my reading of that story in the Bible study, I read it as if there was a competition between all 3 of them to reach Jesus. In fact, there was an actual competition between at least 2 of them, Jairus and the woman with a flow of blood. Now, in my reading, the graveyard man was the first one off the blocks. Now, he launched towards Jesus. You could argue that his approach to Jesus was involuntary, that it was not him, that he didn't quite know what he was doing, and that he went to Jesus perhaps to say to Jesus, please stay away from me. Now, I think he went to Jesus for help because if he really wanted peace, he could have just stayed in the comfort of living in a graveyard, which is where he actually lived. Now, imagine how from one end of the crowd that was milling around Jesus, there's a woman trying to reach to Jesus because she's got this unstoppable flow of blood. From the other end, there's this synagogue leader, Jairus, who is also going towards Jesus to beg for help for his daughter. And he reaches Jesus first, obviously, because he's a man and he could push harder through the crowd. And while Jesus is still talking to him and probably walking with him towards his house, arrives this woman who recognizes that, not being a man, without a name in that story, she had to do something subversive. And she went behind Jesus, touched his garment, and stole power from him to get her healing. Now, I want to suggest that COVID-19 has put the world in that situation where we are all competing to reach out for help, to reach out for a cure, to reach out to Jesus if you want to be spiritual about it, and that the world is indeed, or has indeed become, a graveyard. Certainly some countries more than others, but the entire world has been like a graveyard. And I think we are graveyard men and women ourselves, not dead yet, but close enough to the gravesite, living there, as it were. The second metaphor which I want to touch on very briefly is that of the world as a prison. And I'm jumping through many of my notes. Now, I borrowed this metaphor of the world as a prison from Ben Okri, the Nigerian writer, former Booker Prize winner, with his book, The Famished Road. Last year, he published his new book, The Freedom Artist, in which he paints a picture of the world as a prison. Now, the world has been a prison in 2020. I don't think Ben Okri could have imagined that it would happen so soon, because all of us were locked in prisons. The prisons were our own homes. The prisons were our own countries within our borders. Now, in the book, The Freedom Artist, not only is the whole world a giant prison, but actually people in that world live according to the most brutal and the most ridiculous rules and regulations. Thinking is a criminal offense in that world. Books have been banned for so long that people have forgotten how to write and how to make books. Sleeping, including sleepwalking, is mandatory. So is wailing at night. People are losing their minds in that country. Those with minds to lose, that is. In this world, the rich minority lives in luxury and the poor scramble for bread in the streets. But here's the thing. Despite all these absurd and dictatorial regulations, the secretive and elusive hierarchy with a capital H, that rules that world does not allow anyone to see, depict, or name that world as a prison. Instead, the hierarchy does everything in its power, and it had all the power to suppress all propagation of past and present knowledge of the world as a prison. You can't talk about a prison in that country. The concern is that the more often the people hear about and see portrayals of the world as prison, they may realize that indeed they live in a prison. So what does the government do? It pays people to paint kinder, more generous, more gentle pictures of the world, to depict it as a garden rather than a prison. Writers, singers, and artists are encouraged to paint and produce these alternative depictions of the world. But that is just the nice side of things. On the not so nice side of things, there is a special police squad in that country, more like the special anti-robbery squad of Nigeria. This squad does not shoot people down when they protest. No, it consists of cannibals. The police actually eat up the people. So that in that world, you meet many people with missing limbs, no ear, no eye, half a lip gone, because they had been eaten off, beaten off by the cannibalistic police. Now, I don't think Ben Okri knew that SARS was about to happen in Nigeria. He also didn't know that George Floyd would be killed by the police during COVID-19, nor that 11 South Africans would be killed, one of whom was dragged out of his own house to be killed by the police. But that's the picture. Did we or did we not live in a prison? Are we not in a prison now? And the final one, and if I'm running out of my time, I'll stop because I can take some of these issues during discussions, is to go back to Albert Camus's La Peste, the plague in English. Now, this novel of Albert Camus was, of course, located in Algeria, the country of his birth, in the city of Oran. There's something about Algeria because Albert Camus was born there. Jacques Derrida, I think, was also born there. And Frantz Fanon lived there, even though he wasn't born there, was naturalized there. Now, this book is, of course, old now. It was written in 1947 when Camus was 34 years old. I just have a sense that he captures something that only fiction writers can capture. As Zakes Mda, the South African author, says, journalists and historians ask the question, what happened? But fiction writers ask the question, what does it feel like to be in what happened? And I think that is what Camus manages in that novel, many of you, I'm sure, you have read. The people of Oran, that coastal city in Algeria, were taken by surprise when the bubonic plague hit their town. First, they saw rats dying, then human beings started to die in their numbers. And of course, what Camus confronts is the tragedy of human living and human dying in the face of a pandemic. And some of his descriptions of dead bodies and mass burials were particularly visceral and very difficult to handle. In many ways, we saw glimpses of this during this year. Now,
okay.
to conclude.
Tinyiko, if you could wrap it up quick, yeah.
Okay, let me just wrap it up quickly then in 1 minute. Because as I say, I can come back to these issues.
Yes.
South Africa, in 300 years, South Africa has had 5 epidemics. And if South Africa was a microcosm of the world, I think the way South Africa has responded to the epidemics is the way the world is likely to respond. So South Africa had smallpox, bubonic plague, polio, HIV/AIDS, and now COVID-19. Apartheid, as we have come to know it in South Africa, is the most original response to the epidemic. The first separation of people and the creation of so-called locations in South Africa was a response to a pandemic, to the bubonic plague in particular. And of course, when influenza came in 1918, it was the first time the government thought of building houses for white people. So I argue that there's a disruption that comes with a pandemic, but the disruption is hardly ever the kind that comes in the shape of look for. Verse 18. It's not good news to the poor, and it's likely to be good news to the poor even this time around. I'll stop.
Thank you.